Welcome back to another episode of CM180 Communications. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. I am one of your hosts, Allie Silcoff, and I'm joined here by my fellow co-hosts, Carolyn Yee and Timmy Lay. As we usually do, today we will discuss a controversial event in history, leverage communication theories to offer better insight on the topic, and then offer a potential solution to the issue at hand. Today's topic will be the Pentagon Papers. You are probably thinking, what are or were the Pentagon Papers? Let's discuss what it was and how it affected our nation. Carolyn and Timmy, want to start?
Yes. So, the Pentagon Papers were a 47-volume top-secret government document that contained the history of the U.S.'s involvement, on both a political and a military level, in the Vietnam War between the years 1945 and 1967. It was a study commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense that was classified as top secret to not expose the incriminating information that it contained about America's role in the Vietnam War.
That's right, and in 1970, Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who was involved in the creation of the Pentagon Papers, secretly photocopied and leaked 2 copies of the file to 2 prominent newspaper companies, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Ellsberg was unsettled that Americans were being severely misled about this unwinnable war and wanted the media to show Americans the truth that the government was hiding.
And after years spent carefully analyzing and making sense of these documents, on June 13, 1971, the New York Times finally decided to publish the first installment of a series of articles based on the Pentagon Papers. Richard Nixon, who was the president of the U.S. at the time, was incredibly angry that this highly confidential information that the Department of Defense for years tried to keep secret was suddenly made available to everyone in America. To protect the U.S.'s national defense interests, Nixon obtained a court injunction against the Times, barring them from further publishing the documents. The Times was forced to obey the order and stopped publishing.
At the same time, however, the Washington Post published its own set of stories based on the Pentagon Papers. Like the Times, the Post was barred from publishing and both newspaper companies were taken to the Supreme Court.
For 2 weeks, the 2 biggest newspapers in the country were prohibited from publishing truthful, newsworthy information that, according to the First Amendment of the United States, people had the right to know.
With the principle of freedom of the press in mind, after 2 weeks in court, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspapers, freeing them to publish the documents. This was a landmark case that proved how valuable and important the First Amendment is to American society and democracy as a whole.
So, looking at our first theory today, it seems the actions of the significant event in history exhibited what is called gatekeeping theory. Gatekeeping theory can be defined as being able to, quote, control the public's knowledge of the actual events by letting some stories pass through the system but keeping others out, end quote. So, it is a 50-year-old theory that is concerned with how the flow of information is regulated.
So how and why was the gatekeeping theory used in the case of the Pentagon Papers?
Well, when Ellsberg released these papers to the New York Times and the Washington Post, there was a plethora of information that was given, and these news outlets couldn't release everything right away, if at all. That's an important part to remember because, as per gatekeeping's definition, they had a choice what the public could and should know.
Let's talk about the New York Times first. They were really the first news outlet to release information on the Pentagon Papers.
Sure. The first newspaper published by them had the headline, Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement. So that was the headline. And they began the article with an emphasis on this so-called massive Pentagon study. So that's what the New York Times chose to release to the public that first day. But they kept going. It wasn't just going to stop at the news that the U.S. was involved in Vietnam, there was more.
So much more. The next day, the NYT released yet another article on not only the U.S.'s involvement, but the president's involvement. It was found, and I quote, that the Johnson administration reached the general consensus at a White House tragedy on September 7, 1964, that the air attacks against North Vietnam would probably have been to be launched. So this action took place at the height of the presidential election between President Johnson and Senator Barry Goldwater.
What we can see from this information in relation to gatekeeping theory is that out of all the information the New York Times received from Ellsberg, which was a lot by the way, it was a 2.5 million word study. But what we can see is that the New York Times found this information appropriate to share with the public at this time, over everything else. And in fact, it was the newspapers released by the New York Times that caused President Nixon and his staff to hear about the Pentagon study for the first time.
Wow. So now the Washington Post, once they received the papers, they immediately started publishing stories that were similar to those of the New York Times, right?
That is correct. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post wanted to expose Ellsberg's findings, and the Pentagon Papers were, quote, probably the single largest unauthorized disclosure of classified documents in the history of the U.S., end quote. And as information was coming out, the Pentagon Papers became the most sought-after set of papers in the nation. And just a reminder, because it's important to note that the public had no idea this was going on at all until the New York Times published newspapers, until the Washington Post published newspapers on it, and this was the information they decided to share at the time. Of course, now there's a lot more you could find and piece together, but putting yourself in the shoes of the public during the time this was going on, these news outlets were the only resource the public could go off of, and it essentially controlled the news they heard, and the New York Times and Post created these mental pictures for the public on what was going on in the world around them, making them gatekeepers.
Based on the NYT and Washington Post decision to release the information, they obviously didn't consult the public before it happened. There were mixed reactions from the U.S. citizens as a result. Some people were in support of the exposure of this case study, saying they appreciate the courageous stand against government infringement on the freedom of press to supply us with the truth, while others wish it hadn't been released at all, saying, this is the type of action that is destroying the United States from within, and to say the very least, causing the public not to know what to believe.
In the end, not everyone will be happy with how it was handled, but it wasn't their choice. The New York Times and Washington Post were presented with information and upheld the roles as gatekeepers because they specifically decided what information the public would receive and what they wouldn't. And so it is for these reasons that the gatekeeping theory was used to make the public aware of the major issues that were coming from the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam.
That was the Pentagon Papers on gatekeeping theory. We believe it's also important to look at this event through the lens of agenda cutting. Okay, so what is agenda cutting? Agenda cutting is an extension of McCombs and Shaw's agenda setting theory that postulates that the media cannot tell audiences what to think, but it can tell them what to think about. Agenda cutting is one of the ways in which the media is able to decide whether an issue becomes a major one in the eyes of the public by ensuring a topic receives little or no media coverage.
Professor Rita Kolstria of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, explains that agenda cutting happens in three ways: placing an item low on the news agenda, keeping an item completely off the mainstream news agenda, or removing an item from the agenda, usually due to some outside forces intervention, such as political, advertiser, or public relations pressures.
So how did agenda cutting come into play with the Pentagon Papers?
In the case of the Pentagon Papers, the third method of agenda cutting was attempted by the United States government. In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed both the New York Times and Washington Post to publish the Pentagon Papers after President Nixon attempted to censor the New York Times from continuing to publish copies of the papers.
Also, the Espionage Act was cited as a reason to keep the Pentagon Papers out of publication. But the Supreme Court found that the U.S. public had no reason to not have the information and ruled that there were no cause for prior restraint, which is when the government is able to prevent publication.
Correct. The U.S. government's attempt to keep the Pentagon Papers out of the newspapers was an example of agenda cutting because they knew that if the papers were released to the public through the media, there would be outrage over the true details of the Vietnam War contained in the papers. The media's powerful ability to set the agenda for what the public sees as important caused this case to go to the Supreme Court to avoid government secrets from being released.
And that was our segment on agenda cutting. So we have now analyzed the Pentagon Papers through the theories of gatekeeping and agenda cutting. But could this have been better resolved? And how could this affect our nation today?
It's clear that there are some issues regarding the relationship between the government and the media, but how do we go about mending it?
I think it's extremely important for the government and the media to have a mutual agreement of respect. It is the media's job to display correct information to the public, which the public has the right to know. It is also the job of the media to expose government corruption and make sure that elected representatives do what they set out to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think the majority of what we see today comes from the rapid ability of the media and the government to send out information. Both sides are so quick to send out hateful and or untrue information, which backlashes their counterparts.
So true. It's evident that even the highest officials are guilty of such acts. We see our own president, one of the most powerful people in the world, tweeting at news sites like CNN and others, calling them fake news. Trump even uses hearings as a time to get words in. We've seen him take time to call out bad reporting or what he believes to be bad reporting during a COVID-19 press reporting on national television. There has to be other times to do things like this.
Yes, so it is said that President Trump has, quote, a particularly fraught relationship with the media, end quote, and that it lies to people. So what would be your solution to this problem?
Well, President Trump's criticism of the media seems to emulate that of President Nixon's in the 1970s when the Pentagon Papers were actually going on. Nixon had characterized the U.S. media as being, quote, nattering naboobs of negativism. And like Trump, he discouraged the media's criticism of government. So you asked about a solution to this problem. I think to start, we should limit what the president can say on social media. Controlling his Twitter account will allow for a greater relationship and help him gain more respect from the media. Since the start of America, the government has relied on the media to send out information to the public when necessary.
That's a great point, especially when people already don't know what to believe. Hence our talk on gatekeeping and agenda-cutting. So, Timmy, what do you think of education and emphasizing the importance of the impact of knowledge today, and how could that play a role?
The impact of knowledge is huge, especially today. And so I think we further educate students interested in media. Government should help foster the correct skills of being in the media without corrupting youthful minds. Teaching new media members the importance of fact-checking, basic ethics, and creativity can allow for a better relationship. I also think this background education can help ensure that all party members are experienced and have ideas to offer.
Well said, Timmy. And I think it's very important that the government understands the difference between support, supervision, and influence. The government should not influence new media members in any way, but support them and encourage all forms of media. The media should know right from wrong and make educated guesses on what to report.
Yes, I agree to all of that. All right, everyone. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today, but that was a great conversation, and we hope all of you listening could take away something from our talk today. What the Pentagon Papers were, how the gatekeeping and agenda-cutting theories apply to it, and why it's important to maintain a stable government and media relationship.
And a special thanks to our producer and editor for today's podcast, Emma Cohen. Thank you for tuning in today, everyone.
Have a great day, and we'll catch you all next time on CM180 Communications.